Critical thinking and creativity, two factors which define one's ability to discover and optimize speedrunning routes. Even more so for Metroidvania games, featuring winding, nonlinear paths, rendering the process significantly more complex. Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania title, with numerous optional upgrades, sequence breaks, and avenues for progression to consider when speedrunning the game. For Hollow Knight's most popular speedrunning category, any % no major glitches, these routes have been studied to death. In the past 3.5 years, the route has hardly changed. But in late 2017, 8 months after the game's release, the route was almost flipped on its head. It began with the idea of skipping Beast Sten using Monarch Wings, the game's double jump. But in order for this to be faster, Monarch Wings must somehow allow us to also save time elsewhere. The most obvious potential time save being a way to acquire Isma's Tear, thereby skipping Crystal Heart. Yet Isma's Tear and Monarch Wings are both abilities known for taking significant amounts of time to acquire. How could it be possible to attain these two abilities, both gated behind bosses, without losing significant amounts of time? To everyone else, the question seemed hardly worth a thought. But the youngest Hollow Knight speedrunner in the community took the seemingly impossible idea as an intellectual challenge. This player, who began their Hollow Knight journey at the age of 14, spent a 24-hour period performing the most fruitful lab session in the history of the game, discovering several incredible skips that, piece by piece, revealed the route was not only doable, but competitive with what is still today known as the optimal route through the game. This is the story of how they almost rewrote Hollow Knight's most popular speedrunning category. First, let's introduce Moglar 5K, or Mog, previously known as Megalore 9000, or Mag. His name might sound familiar for those who have seen Hollow Knight randomizer runs. In the randomizer mod, tricks required to obtain key items are separated into different categories, so players may choose to disable categories of tricks which they aren't able to perform. The tricks that are borderline impossible and require incredible in-depth knowledge of the game are separated into their own category, Mag skips. This was because Mag had a reputation for finding absurdly difficult, convoluted skips, which had no implications for speedruns, but saw occasional use in randomizer runs. Yet Mag was also known for having found several skips which defined the speedrunning routes which have existed to this day. Have you ever heard of Explosion Pogo? How about the Forgotten Crossroads Acid Skip? How about the True Ending Shade Skip? These were all found by one person, Moglar 5K. You might also be surprised to learn that Mag, despite being the youngest speedrunner in the entire Hollow Knight community, had also achieved world records numerous times, and in numerous categories. Prior to this, Mag even had a reputation of being a top runner in Undertale at the age of 13, achieving personal bests second only to TGH. Following his stint in Hollow Knight, Mag topped the leaderboards as a speedrunner in several other games, such as Environmental Station Alpha, The End Is Nigh, and the incredibly competitive speed game Celeste. In Celeste, other runners even jokingly deemed second place the non-Megalore world record, since their hopes of getting the actual world record were so distant. It's clear that Mag was an incredible speedrunner who left a distinct mark on these communities. But something which has become forgotten to time was the story of how Mag almost rerouted the Hollow Knight speedrun. Since the discovery of the Blue Lake Shade skip in April 2017, a mere 2 months after the game's release, the any % no major glitches route has remained roughly the same. But in October 2017, everything almost changed. But before we get into that, let's discuss some necessary background information. First, let's take a look at the any % no major glitches speedrun. In no major glitches categories, there are many items we use which aren't required to beat the game, such as Mothwing Cloak. We use Mothwing Cloak because it helps us progress through the game significantly faster. Other items, such as Dreamnail and Mantis Claw, are strict requirements to beat the game, as they're needed to reach the Dreamers and therefore unlock the Black Egg Temple. In no major glitches categories, the only ability requirement which has any wiggle room at all takes the form of a singular choice. Either Isma's Tear, which allows us to swim through acid, or Crystal Heart, the game's super dash. One of these two items is needed in order to bypass the acid pool underneath Monomon in Teacher's Archives. All the other acid pools in the game can be bypassed using different methods. Crystal Heart is the ability we settled on for the run because it fits well into the any % no major glitches route. The main prerequisites for acquiring Crystal Heart are making Sly return to his shop, which we do as we prepare to shade skip into Blue Lake, and collecting enough Geo to purchase the Lantern, which we gather as we move through City of Tears. The Lantern is necessary for this route, as it allows us to interact with the toll in the dark room leading to Crystal Peaks. There's just one problem here, which is that it simply takes a lot of time. In fact, this process represents a huge portion of the entire speedrun. It encompasses everything from talking to Sly, picking up relics, defeating Gorgeous Husk, farming enemies for Geo, opening the shortcuts to Lem, making Lem return to his shop, selling relics to Lem, returning to Dirtmouth, purchasing the Lantern, benching, traveling to Crystal Peaks, going all the way to the top of Crystal Peaks, and finally collecting Crystal Heart. And don't forget save and quitting back to the bench. It's clear that this incredibly lengthy process has some potential to be optimized. In fact, to this day we are still debating ways to optimize our Geo collection. But can it be rerouted? Let's take a look at the alternative. The first question one would inevitably have about this new route is how do we get Isma's Tear so quickly? Acquiring Isma's Tear, the intended method, is out of the question, as it ordinarily requires Crystal Heart to obtain in the first place. In other categories, they perform a skip known as the Isma's Tear skip using Crystal Heart, involving a series of acid skips to collect Isma's Tear without having to fight Dung Defender. Yet in this route, we intend to do the same thing without using Crystal Heart. Most would assume this to be a dead end, but let's assume we could get through this room. In the final room, this is what we find. A seemingly impossible gap to clear, even with Monarch Wings. But how is it even possible to get Monarch Wings in the first place when we don't have Crystal Heart? Don't forget, there's a giant pit we need to cross in order to reach Broken Vessel. The intended method of doing so is simply by using Crystal Heart. I should note that Team Cherry was also quite thorough in ensuring that one couldn't simply wall jump up to the other side. What kind of a person looks at these obstacles and thinks, we might be able to save some time with this? There was only one person, and it was Moglar 5K. Now it's time to start talking about the development of the route. On September 8th, 2017, almost 7 months after the game's release, a player by the name of Meg was having a conversation with the God Gamer, and the topic of skipping Beast's Den using Monarch Wings came up. all because we hated beast den spiders. Although arguably wanting to skip the grub was a subconscious motive as well. Mag speculated about the possibility of using Monarch Wings and Isma's Tear to replace Crystal Heart. As we know, Mag had a history of finding creative skips in the past. Despite that, the idea of this skip being possible wasn't something I seriously considered. It seemed far-fetched and, quite frankly, impossible. So I interpreted this as a joke. To Mag, however, this would become an intellectual exercise which would eventually develop into the creation of an entirely new route. On October 22nd, 2017, a month and a half later, Mag finally donned his lab coat and got to work figuring this route out. He immediately discovered you could skip into the Isma's Tear room using Monarch Wings and Spell Twister. Spell Twister was necessary because this trick required a fireball skip. Fireball skips are tricks which exploit the mechanics of the Vengeful Spirit spell to enable the player to gain more horizontal distance while in the air. These mechanics are that Vengeful Spirit pushes you backwards and that it resets your fall speed when it's cast. While this discovery wasn't useful on its own because Spell Twister is so far out of the way of the current route, it did serve as an interesting starting point. Further developing this discovery, Mag found later on the same day that skipping through the beginning of the final Isma's Tear room was also possible using Monarch Wings, Spell Twister, and Dashmaster. This skip required you to time your Vengeful Spirit casts very precisely, such that you slowed down your falling speed by rhythmically turning around and casting the spell. As an example to demonstrate, take a look at these two clips. In this clip, I use all my fireballs at the peak of my jump, and in the second, I use my fireballs at rhythmic intervals to decrease my fall speed back to 0 multiple times. As you can see, I'm able to clear a much larger horizontal distance in the second clip. Dashmaster was required for this skip because it decreases the cooldown time of each dash. Thus, the amount of time you spend falling in between the two dashes at the start is lowered. So when you dash twice off the wall, you remain higher above the acid. While this skip was doable in a vacuum, in the context of the run, however, it still wasn't possible. We simply had no way to enter that room with any amount of soul. Meg theorized a way to gain soul could be by luring a Whormp to the area before the transition, so that it could be hit with the Dream Nail. Ultimately, however, nothing came of that idea. Shortly following this, Mag made a huge discovery, making the skip seem significantly more realistic. He found that if you entered the Isma's Tear room, you could actually backtrack through the previous room without spending any soul. You could attack the Whormps in that room till your soul was full, then jump back into the acid, and the game would respawn you back at the room transition leading to Isma's Tear. This is because of how hazard respawn checkpoints in Hollow Knight work. Hazard respawn checkpoints are invisible boxes in the room that when touched become active. When you fall into a hazard such as acid or thorns, the game respawns you at the last hazard respawn checkpoint that you touched. The room to the left when entered from the Isma's Tear room doesn't actually have any hazard respawn checkpoints which are touched by taking the path up to the Whormps. If the player strays too far to the left, their hazard respawn checkpoint will update, meaning that if the player touches the acid, they will instead respawn to the left, instead of at the transition where they entered from. Because of this discovery, Mag learned that you could enter both parts of the Isma's Tear skip with full soul. This actually marked the discovery of a new route, albeit a much slower one, because it required a huge detour to collect Spell Twister. If Mag wanted to make this new route successful, he needed to find a way to do it without this charm. So Mag set out to discover a way to complete the 2 parts of the skip with only 3 casts of Fireball or less. Just a couple of hours later, on the evening of that same day, he discovered new ways to get through both rooms with only 3 Vengeful Spirit casts. The first room skip simply required more precision. You couldn't lose any height. While the trick was difficult with 4 Vengeful Spirit casts, it was extremely difficult with 3, but still barely possible. The second room skip was different. It required you to pray that a Horp spawned in a position where you could lure it over by shooting a fireball at it. Although not ideal, as it relied on an enemy to randomly spawn in the correct position, Mag proved that this route was doable without Spell Twister. There was, however, another challenge with this route. We're going to dive into a completely different skip, which is required to get to this point in the first place. Remember how I said that normally you can't get Monarch Wings without Crystal Heart? Now, there's no normal way to get through this section without super dashing. This wall on the left simply isn't traversable. You might say that's easy, just do a shade skip. And you'd be half right. You do perform a shade skip, but it is not that simple. The problem with the shade skip is that the shade spawns off-screen to the left. It's too far away for you to get its attention so that it begins following you. But there are actually 2 ways to get an enemy's attention. First, by getting really close to it, or by attacking it. Our only realistic option to attack it is with Vengeful Spirit, which under normal circumstances kills the shade in 1 hit. Mag attempted this shade skip, but couldn't figure out how to successfully aggro the shade. Another player by the name of Ushepti discovered that it was doable under specific circumstances. Your shade's health actually scales with 2 variables: how many masks you have, and your current nail damage. This meant that by purchasing a nail upgrade, your shade gained enough health to survive the Vengeful Spirit cast. To complete this skip, we have to do that, then lure the shade, parry its attack, and then pogo off of it in order to be able to reach Broken Vessel. So you can perform the shade skip by purchasing a nail upgrade. But purchasing a nail upgrade is time consuming, and keep in mind that this route does not ever normally journey to the left side of City of Tears. It is, therefore, a considerable detour to go all the way over to the nailsmith. While we knew the route was possible at this point, the fact that we had to make such a detour called into question whether the route was actually faster in reality. The very next day, on October 23, 2017, a new discovery was made. It enabled us to perform the final Isma's Tears skip without having to pogo on an enemy. This was the most difficult speedrunning skip ever found in Hollow Knight to this day. It involved the use of a mechanic that didn't see use in speedruns until 2021. Thus, the discovery was, by definition, years ahead of its time. People quickly notice when playing the game that hitting any enemy or wall with your nail will result in a very small amount of knockback. How does that tie into the trick? Well, what if we used this knockback, turning around to hit the wall so quickly that we actually propelled ourselves forward just a few pixels? The idea that a major route-enabling skip would be discovered using a mechanic which, when performed frame perfectly, allowed you to move only a couple extra pixels forward was difficult to believe. Mag discovered that this skip was just barely possible by exploiting this knockback. The skip demanded perfection in practically every input. Your dashes had to be at the perfect height. Your turnaround nail swing and fireballs had to be frame perfect. Your fireballs had to be performed at optimal intervals of time. Meg discovered it was possible by performing the majority of the trick, then missing the double jump at the very end. To this day, only one player, Insomnia, has successfully performed the skip in its entirety. It happened over 3 years after the skip was discovered, on November 9th, 2020. Meg finally found that the route was possible, and without having to rely on extreme luck for an enemy to spawn in the perfect position. But at the time, a new discovery dissuaded players from ever exploring it. At this point in the history of the run, we still used a nail upgrade, as we believed it was required to perform Umu 2 cycle. However, Moglar discovered an Umu 2 cycle strategy which was possible even without a nail upgrade. This enabled us to switch to what we called the Nail Zero route. Because the Isthmus Tier route was only possible with a nail upgrade, and we discovered that Nail Zero was faster, the Isthmus Tier route began to look unappealing in comparison, especially given its extreme difficulty. Ultimately, the any % no major glitches Isthmus Tier route was buried in the speedrunning Discord, never to be seen except for by some of the game's most active speedrunners. Despite the effort and creativity which went into its discovery, the route has never been run as part of a full game speedrun. The route diverged so much from the standard any % no major glitches route. People estimated that it lost time, but no one truly put forth the effort to time the individual rooms. Even if it did save a small amount of time, it's quite likely that people would achieve more success relying on the standard consistent route with which they could successfully complete significantly more runs. Though this route never saw any use, to me, its development was one of the most exciting points in the history of Hollow Knight speedrunning. In just a single day's time, the Hollow Knight community went from being thoroughly convinced that the current route was optimal to thinking we might have had it wrong all along. It demonstrated another side of speedrunning which many don't ever see. The innovation, creativity, and hard work that are all at play behind the scenes. For many, the hobby isn't just about doing runs, but about contributing to the collaborative vision of how to achieve the fastest run possible. And don't forget that it was almost all masterminded by literally the youngest speedrunner of the community. Moglar 5K is no longer active within the Hollow Knight community, but he has confirmed his interest in spending time speedrunning Silksong on its release. I look forward to seeing the incredible discoveries he makes in the new game. As for what he's doing now, let's take a peek